All right, so if we have any other people joining in, then that's fine, but I'm just going to start. So, in this classroom, we are going to primarily focus on composition, but just for the assignment of day 2, I did wanted to give you guys some pointers on how you can handle the assignment better, to just to learn more efficiently and get a better result. So for the first part here, we're going to be talking a little bit about shadow mapping. Not too much, but just a little bit. As you can see right now, I'm doing this digitally for a change, by the way, because it's just easier for me to show all the steps, especially when it comes to composition. But for this rock, for instance, that I did for the assignment that you saw on the video of this week, basically I do a certain process that I follow in order to enable myself to get the best possible result for that study, and also not only practice, learning how to draw a rock or the subject at hand, but also learning how to increase my shadow mapping, my design sense, and my lighting sense, right? So for this rock, for instance, I didn't find the reference photo anymore, but it's okay. It's just a rock, right? And I was looking at a rock, and it was lit from this side, right, like that. And so when I see that, that's the first thing that I'm looking for. When I look at the subject at hand, when you guys are looking at, the mountains that you have to do, or the rocks, or the trees, or whatever, first determine where the light is coming from, okay? And the kind of simple object that you're drawing. In this case, that's the reason why I made you guys in day 1 draw so many boxes, is because basically rocks are some sort of boxes with a lot of planes cut off, right? Or added to them. So I established my lighting source, and then I start establishing where I think all the shadows will be hitting. So all the planes that I believe will be in shadow, and I can determine this off of my reference photo. So the reference photo that you'll be using, try to really make it clear for yourself where the shadow planes are going to be. So in the rock that I was doing, I was seeing my entire shadow area being something like this. Right. And notice that and this comes to having a good sense of design, notice that my shadow shapes aren't fragmented. They might be fragmented in the reference photo, but as designers, as illustrators, we try to make things as aesthetically pleasing as possible. So shadow grouping, that's also a term, is very common amongst just illustrators and artists, because it makes for a better read in your composition. So this is the shadow group that I have established. And if we look at how I shaded it, right, you can instantly recognize a three-dimensional plane. So as soon as you fill in your shadow shape and you did it successfully, basically most of your work is done here. Okay, then it just comes to rendering. But having a good design shape for your shadow shapes and your light shapes it's almost like 80% of the work. The rest is just rendering, right? So as you can see, I only did this in a couple of layers, and normally I would even do it on one layer, but just for demonstration purposes, I did it on a couple of layers. And then as soon as I establish my shadow map, and if you have a hard time understanding what shadow map is, please check out the shading tutorials on the website, as well as the charcoal portrait tutorial that I have on the exclusive tutorial sections, because I talk a lot more in depth about shadow mapping there. Okay, and then so for my layer 2, I basically transform that graphic looking posterized image of a rock, and I soften it up and make it look more realistic. Again, at all times, I'm thinking about the basic fundamental features of light and shadow, right? So I'm considering my core shadows, I'm considering my ambient occlusion, I'm considering my bounce light, and I'm considering my halftones. That doesn't change whether I'm looking at a portrait, a rock, a tree, a mountain, whatever, right? Usually the rules of light stay exactly the same. Sometimes, depending on the kind of material that it's being cast on, that might change, right? Especially if you have very translucent elements like gems or, like insect skin, something that is very translucent. Some of those rules might change, but other than that, usually when you have solid objects, it stays the same. The rules of light stay the same. Try to find your core shadows, try to find your shadow shape, try to find your bounce lights and your halftones. If you can do that successfully, you will almost always end up with a nice looking picture. Okay, and then it just comes to adding maybe a bit more detail, because the rock that I was looking at had some grass on top of it. So I tried to indicate that with the values that I'm doing here. Again, it's important, and that's what I tell you in the video as well. Try to do this in grayscale. The reason that you need to do this in grayscale is to really focus on the values and get a good and realistic read of the objects that you're studying with values alone. Adding color later, that's the easy part. Trust me, it's getting that good grasp on values, which is important, right? And that's just what I wanted to have you take away from this lecture about shadow mapping. Now, when we look at the cloud that I did, it's even easier for a cloud and maybe a bit harder for a lot of you, because with a cloud, you actually do the exact same thing. You establish your shadow shape. So if I just get rid of my shadow shape, this is basically my cloud, right? In the sky. It's just a 2D graphic like you would draw as a kid. The artistic side comes to adding three-dimensionality to this cloud. So what I do is I establish, again, just like as if it were a simple shape, I group my shadows together, right? I also think about the perspective, because basically for me this cloud is a box. We have this underside of that cloud, and then we have this plane and this plane, right? It's basically sitting in a box. So that's also what I'm thinking about when I'm drawing this shadow shape. And then we have a shadow shape over here, maybe this one, right? So I'm trying to minimize the amount of shadow shapes that I'm making, because if I didn't group them together like you saw me do with the rock and you saw me do here, what ends up happening is that everything becomes very noisy. So for instance, if I were just to make this a shadow shape and then make a shadow shape here, maybe make this a shadow shape, but all do it separately, things would become pretty noisy, right? So always try, if you can, to make your shadow shapes as readable as possible and as graphically interesting as possible, right? And that's all I did for this cloud, basically. I only added a shadow shape, which already makes it look like a cloud. And then you can start, maybe, especially for clouds, you could start adding, if I merge this down, you could start softening some of the edges, right? Because clouds don't really have that hard of a silhouette. And in some places you could get some lost edges where the sky kind of blends in with the cloud. And then it really starts reading like a cloud. And then it just becomes a matter of adding color to this, which will make it, even more believable. But getting the values right in the beginning is the most important. All right. So, did that make sense about the shadow mapping? It's going to be brief. All right. Great. Okay, so and then moving on to composition, because that's going to be your biggest struggle for day 3 of this week's assignment, or for assignments in the future, right? This classroom is really geared towards just getting you on, on board with composition, so you can rewatch this video a lot of the times when you need to. The goal of this classroom and its composition is really to familiarize yourself with the basics of composition, or at least what I think are the basics. There are a lot of tutorials on composition, and people that might explain it differently. So, just as a small disclaimer, this is my opinion when it comes to composition, but these are some of the best practices that I've seen and that I use myself when I need to do landscapes or, illustration. So one of the most basic and the most obvious that you already heard of is called the rule of thirds, right? And so what basically the rule of thirds means is that you have your canvas and you divide it into 3 equal parts, whether that's horizontally or vertically. You have your 1, 2, 3 and your 1, 2, 3, right? So you have 3 equal parts for each canvas. And the reason why artists tend to do this is because where those points intersect is usually where artists, or especially photographers, that's why in your in your camera view you have that rule of thirds as well, or that grid system. It's because you can add interest to those intersecting points. So and I have 2 examples here that I'll be using throughout the classroom to kind of illustrate my point. So these 2 compositions that I did, they work quite well. They're very rough, but that's kind of the idea of making landscape thumbnails, is that you want the composition and the value read to be the first and most important thing when you're designing anything, basically. And establishing your focal points and establishing your visual weight is one of the most important things. And so when you just follow the rule of thirds, as you can see in my compositions, that my focal points sort of fall onto that grid, right? Especially the main focal points that I want the viewer to look at, they usually fall onto that intersection. So that's why artists tend to use this rule of thirds. Now there's another rule that is a bit more advanced than the rule of thirds, which is called the golden ratio. And I divided my entire screen here into the golden ratio. And for people who are not familiar with the golden ratio, there are many, many, many ways that you can come up with the golden ratio. And one of them, which is very confusing in my sense, is that you divide a square in half, and then you take the middle, and then you, with a compass, you kind of go down like this, and you create your golden ratio, and then you can split it up. But honestly, I wouldn't consider myself or concern myself with that, because it's just so overcomplicated. Like, a really nice rule that I think works really well, and that's why I recommended you guys look at Andrew Tischler's video, is that the ratio is usually 1 to 1.618, right? This is the golden ratio that most people, or that is used, that mathematically, that is the golden ratio. And so if you want your canvas, or if you want to divide your canvas into the golden ratio, what you simply do is you estimate the width or the length of your canvas, right? So in this case, my canvas is, I'm not sure what my canvas is. Right, so the width is 3,960 pixels and the height is 2,160, okay? So you take that 3960 pixels and you divide it by 1.618. And the resulting, which will be, I don't know, about 2700 something, right? That is basically the width of this square here. Right? And that's how you can divide your canvas into the golden ratio. And you can do the same thing for the height. And you can do it multiple times. All right, so you can do it here as well. You can do it here. And then you can even redivide this space into the rule of thirds, which will give you something like this. And then you can divide this plane into the rule of thirds, which will basically be this. And then you can divide this one, and then you can divide this one, which basically ultimately will end you up with that quintessential golden ratio spiral, right? Can everybody follow that? It's not the most important knowledge that you need to know. It's just that that's how the golden ratio sort of works. Okay. Great. So if we get rid of that and we look at the golden ratios in my examples, the ones in reds are the primary golden ratios that I've measured, and then the ones in blue are the tertiary golden ratios. So with the secondary golden ratios, sorry. And so the secondary golden ratio is, for instance, this width. I took the golden ratio, divided it by 1.618, and then I got this line, right? And so this is how you could divide up your canvas to find, even more interesting focal points here and there, if you wanted to, So it's a nice way to create secondary and tertiary focal points, and it will look a lot more natural than if you were to wing it. However, when you're doing thumbnails and stuff like that, I'm not a big fan of mathematically defining your canvas. And this is completely up to you. If you like doing that stuff, by all means do it. I like to go by feeling. I just like it more. But, sometimes my feeling, tells me I'm right, because my horizon line in this picture is exactly on that secondary golden ratio. So that kind of contributes to what makes this composition work. All right, and so that's it for the golden ratio. Again, don't stress yourself over it. I usually just use the rule of thirds, and even I don't even use the rule of thirds. I just eyeball the rule of thirds, right? When I'm thumbnailing my landscapes, I'm just thinking, right, okay, this is probably somewhere of a third, so I want my focal point to be here. And that for me is enough, right? But if you want to do it a bit more intense, by all means, be my guest. Okay, and then talking about real estate, that's something that I also want to discuss, especially when you're doing landscapes, but even when you're doing interiors. In the beginning, when you are a beginner, it's good to divide up your canvas into like two elements. And what I mean by that is, as you can see in the example that I have right now, again, following that rule of thirds, like 1/3 of my canvas is sky, and 2/3 of my canvas is land mass and rocks, right? This one is a bit of an exception because there's a lot more rocks and land mass here. This is more like a 1/5 sort of thing, or maybe 1/5 is only skyline. But you can experiment with that. But I would always try to consider real estate in your canvas, because as we'll see with a student example, is that many of you tend to divide things 50-50, like 50% skyline and or 50% sky and 50% landmass, and that kind of creates a boring effect. And you always want something that is dominant and something that is subdominant. So dividing your canvas, especially in the beginning when you're still figuring things out, and following these rule of thirds, that's why they are created, because they actually work. Following that rule is actually a good idea. All right. So that's it for the rule of thirds. Then moving on to visual weight. Did anyone have any questions on the rule of thirds, or was everything clear? Okay. Well, just tell me if I'm moving too fast, because sometimes I tend to. Okay, now going on to visual weight. It's actually it kind of walks hand in hand with the rule of thirds, and sometimes if you're already following the rule of thirds pretty well, the visual weight sort of thing kind of comes more natural. But even then, I see a lot of beginners make the mistake of not dividing their canvas properly. And so the main thing that I suggest to beginners when they're trying to divide up their canvas is think of it like a weight scale, right? So think of it like half of your canvas, is being weighted by scales, right? And so we need to have a mass on one side and we need to have a mass on the other side. The problem is, and that's something that I see a lot of beginners do, is that they make a boring division, right? So technically this scale is in balance, right? Because it has two equal weights on on each side. The problem, however, is that it looks quite boring, right? We have the same mass on each side, and I'll show you a student example a little bit later where this is clear. But we have the same information on each side, on the equal sides, and equally spaced from each other on the canvas, and that kind of creates a boring composition. So to give even this simple example a little bit more excitement, you could divide up your canvas like this, right? And this is called like a Steelyard composition. And so that's basically the example that I have down below here. We have a bigger mass closer to the center, and then we have another mass kind of putting a balance to this bigger mass, but it's further down. So it's not equally close to the center line. It's further from it, because in a Steelyard, if you need to balance this scale, right? If you were to put these weights here, that wouldn't get balanced, right? Because just due to center of gravity, it wouldn't work. But if you place it a bit further from that scale, things will start balancing out. And that's basically also what you're trying to do with your canvas. Now, this one on the right is a bit of an exception. And can anyone guess why this is an exception and why it still works? Don't think about lines or anything. Just think about weight. Just think about the division of weight on the scale. Why would you think this still works? And I have the scale here. even then, Mac, the object would be too big. But because you can, I'll give you the answer now. Because this is my center line, right? Yeah, this is my center line. The big object is balancing itself on the opposite side, right? So if I were to shorten this like this, things would get way out of balance. But because it also is balancing itself on the other side, just that one small other weight that I have, which is this one, can balance out the composition. Does that make sense? So you're really thinking about that scale and weight. Okay, so that's usually how you try to balance out your composition. All right, and then lastly, something that is also, I kind of categorize it under visual weight and balance because it has to do with graphic shapes. So in order to create a focal point into your designs, a trick that a lot of artists will use is having a visual contrast of shapes. So that means that instead of using the same shapes all over, so I could have easily, if you look at this example, for instance, we have the roundness of the landscape, we have the roundness of the clouds, right? But then we have a stark contrast of straights, right? And this creates visual interest within my picture. If I were to make these rocks, and let's just do that on another layer, as round as everything else in the landscape, it would still work because of the focal point would still work because I have a clear distinction of values, but it would look more boring because there is no contrast in the shapes that are being used. It's all the same. It's like one blend of shapes, right? So that's kind of something that artists tend to use as well, is having a stark contrast of shapes. Same here, by the way, is that, again, I have curved, by intention, I have curved these other rocks, and I have S-curves going towards my focal point, and then I have straights where I want the viewer to look at, right? It's more of a subtle thing, but it does really help your compositions. Fastir, do you want to have the detail in your subpart of the picture in that case? What subpart do you mean, Fastir? Yeah, a sense of scale is always important, Elski, but that just comes with perspective experience. Yeah, the subpart Fastir, that has to do with the amount of detailing that you put on your focal point will usually already create a focal point, right? So the noise in one particular area of your canvas, which will be your detail, will already create kind of a focal point. So you never want to exaggerate that, especially it's the same as in character designs, right? You always want to have a clear areas of detail and areas of rest, and you do the same with your canvas. However, usually with landscapes, you exaggerate the areas of rest a little bit because you want that clear focal point or focal points, right? There can be usually like 2 to 3 focal points. If you do more, you need to be really experienced to make it work. but that's kind of it when it comes to visual weight. Now let's get rid of these. Okay, so I had another example. These are some notes that I sent to a student about his work. And here I basically also explain the visual weight that you can use when dividing up your canvas. So a lot of the times when students send me work, or I see people, or even just, beginning artists doing landscapes, they start too complicated. They have a scene in mind and they instantly go to the details. And it's like when we compare it again with character designs, like you think about creating a character, but the first thing that you think about is how the folds on the character will fall, right? That's the wrong idea, and that's the wrong thinking. You start with your mannequin, you start with your graphic shapes, and then you start building that character, and you can worry about the folds in the detailing part. And students tend to do the same thing when they start designing landscapes. And I always tell them, just first start with your simple shapes, right? As you can see here, I made this very simple graphic shape. I made it as interesting as I could. I have, a division of 1/3 and 2/3 of sky or real estate. And I have shape contrast of harsh, rectangular shapes versus my focal point. And then I can translate that to this rough sketch, right? I keep it the same. The subject matter at that point doesn't really matter. I knew what the student was going for, so I kind of knew what I needed to draw. But the division of graphic shapes stays the same, right? I use my stark graphic shapes, and then I have that round skull that you see here as my focal point, right? So again, we have shape contrast and we have a good division of real estate. And you can see these mountains that I have in the background. You can sort of consider them as part of the real estate of my 1/3, but I don't, because they'll have so many atmospheric perspective that they become part of the lighter value, which is the sky. Right? And that's basically what I'm considering when I'm doing any of these thumbnails. Same here, stark division of shapes, something that looks interesting, and then my contrasting shape to come up with something that looks like this. Ellie, in these environments you've shown, do you use a vanishing point? Are perspective rules important in landscapes, or is it more used in paintings with buildings? First and foremost, Ellie, perspective is always important. That's why I hammer so much on perspective. It's getting a good natural sense or intuition for perspective is one of the best things that you can learn to do early in your development, because it will just help you immensely. Now, of course, you do have the benefit of 3D these days, where you can basically, what a lot of experienced environment designers do these days is they'll do this, what I'm doing here, right? They'll do that in a thumbnail form, and they have these graphic shapes that they want to see. They figure out their composition, and then they will translate that into a 3D model. Again, usually with very rough shapes. But then they can use their camera angles on what they want specifically, and then they have that perspective information in there, and then they can go back to detailing, right? It's the same thing whether you're using 3D or whether you want to do it completely 2D. Of course, if you want to do it completely 2D, you need a very good sense of perspective, and that's why we are training perspective so much. Okay? All right, and then lastly, that's something that I just wanted to cover briefly, because I don't think it's super important, but there are rules for composition, and there are I think there's a dozen of compositions that have been used throughout history, and getting to know them will definitely help your compositions, but I wouldn't use them as a template, right? Just having them in the back of your mind will definitely help. So I'm just going to go over these. I don't really have examples for them, but just so that you know that they exist. So one of them is called the Steelyard composition, which is something that kind of derives from the scales that I've been talking about. Steelyard is basically a scale where you have a short arm and then a long arm to balance this weight out, right? And so you'll usually see that in a lot of vintage or old school paintings or etchings where you have a big tree in the foreground, right, onto a landscape, and you have a smaller group of trees in the background. Yeah, exactly, Radio Runner. Thank you. Then you have the S-curve composition. It's basically leading the eye up to your focal point or around your composition. You have the pyramid composition, which is usually used in a lot of like movie posters or designs because it kind of gives this empowering feeling where they usually will get the protagonist up on the top of that pyramid, and some of the other actors in there as well, or something else. But usually you see a lot of in movie posters because it just gives that empowering feeling. We have a cross composition, where it's not, I haven't seen it used a lot, but if you imagine like a horizon line and then maybe a boat on this horizon line, it's something that visually makes you look at the cross at hand. It doesn't have to be something like this, the cross can be here as well. It's just something that really, it's because it's such a harsh contrast of diagonal shapes or just lines that it demands your attention. Radiating lines is something that I do really like. In these days, it's not really used as still as this. What I usually do with my lines is I might follow the perspective. So if we go back to this composition, right? I could imagine one of my vanishing points being over here, and then I might use like clouds going in that direction to re-emphasize that perspective. And that's also like part of those radiating lines that you're using to demand focus onto that subject or that focal point. And then we have the L shape. That's one of my favorite compositions that I actually like to use. I usually use it to a default for my foreground. So what you'll see a lot of the times, and actually this one is an example of that as well, is that you could also consider this one like a Dutch angle with an L shape. So this one is actually my L shape in the foreground, right? And then we have the rest of my canvas as real estate, but it's just tilted slightly, but you can still consider it like a Dutch angle L shape. And now, of course, we have the Dutch angle, one of the most commonly used compositions because it adds a lot of drama to your composition, just because it's tilted. So diagonal lines, especially if you read the book Framed Ink, diagonal lines are mostly used for action, right? Because they have that sense of drama and action. They will give a feeling of vibrancy and just action in general. So that's why the Dutch angle is pretty popular. And then you also have a circular composition. I haven't seen it used that much, but it gives more of a sense of a calming effect. Maybe sometimes also a powering effect, but I haven't seen it used commonly. All right, so that's it for visual weight. And then moving on to value, which is also a big factor. So there's a lot of things that I can cover in value, which I just don't have time for in this classroom. But the main thing that I want to give you guys when it comes to value, one of the best practices that you can do when you're starting out to build landscapes is just think about the division of value in your foreground, your midground, and your background. And usually your foreground will be darkest, your midground will be lighter, and then your background will be lightest. This just gives you a nice sense of depth, as you can see in the example that I have here. It's a bit of an exception, but still, I have a pretty dark foreground. Sorry, I have my slightly less darker midground, and then I have a lighter background, right? And just these elements add depth into your scene. It's one of the most commonly used ways to just create depth into a scene. And there are many experienced artists that definitely break these rules, where they will have the lightest value, for instance, in the midground or in the foreground, just to demand your attention. But that just comes from experience. But usually a good rule of thumb is have a dark foreground, a kind of a grayish or like a halftone midground, and then a pretty light background. And then you can still play with these values to add more depth as you go along. Okay, and then value contrast. This is sort of a big one. This is most commonly used. You use this in your character designs as well. The highest amount of detail and the highest contrast of value will usually be a good place to put your focal point. We do that in character design, we do it in creature design, we do it in landscapes as well, right? So I have this, there's a reason why I have my cloud behind the rock here. It's because it just gives the highest contrast of value. Does that mean that my rock is the darkest value? Definitely not. But this dark value in the foreground, right, next to this slightly less darker midground, doesn't give that harsh of a difference. If I were to do this, then this would probably, demand our attention, but it doesn't need to demand our attention, and it would just look weird, right? It just doesn't have that nice gradual sense of depth. So that's why, I use the value contrast of the cloud behind the rock to really extra demand your attention, right? So as you can see with composition, there are a lot of things that you can consider when you're making a picture. So you're considering the visual weight, the division of your canvas, the real estate that you're using, the contrast of shape, the contrast of value. There's a lot of things going on at once, and that's why I think composition is one of the most complex fundamentals, because you can always learn to better your compositions. So that's why I think you shouldn't be too hard on yourself when your compositions aren't working out from the get-go. It always takes time. You need to juggle a lot of things at the same time as well. But just gradually learning, one feature after the other or one fundamental after the other of composition will just make you a better painter or designer. And same thing here. I have a pretty much overall pretty a low-key image, pretty dark values, and even my midground values are pretty dark, but then I give it that harsh contrast by having light shine upon this rock, right? So the value contrast between this and this and this is the highest in the picture. And that's why it's demanding your attention. For this image, how does light play into composition? Does it follow any rules? Well, yeah, light does follow some rules, right? If I wouldn't say there are actual rules that you need to know about light. It's just that it has a direction, and you either, and you just imagine. Usually imagining the direction of your light source is the best thing that you can do. The rule to make a good composition is choosing where that light is coming from. That's the most important thing, right? The kind of story that you want to tell or the kind of mood that you want to design will all depend on the sort of lighting that you're choosing, right? So it would be silly of me to choose a light coming from this direction, because that would it would make it unrealistic that I have just this light beam here, right? Everything would be in light, which would kill my composition. So I choose to have the light coming from behind this rock, just shining slightly onto this. One of the most important things that I can tell you that I really didn't take on too early, and that all the major artists really do, and that I'm starting to learn how to do now, is that you are the master of your composition, right? Especially when it comes to light, a lot of the people or a lot of beginners make the mistake of choosing their light source too realistically. For instance, what a beginner might do is that, okay, I have light coming from this direction, coming from behind the rock. So this will be in light, this will completely be in light, this will be in light, this will be in light. Because in reality, that would actually probably happen. But it's not artistically interesting to do it. So why do it, right? People will believe me if I just make this ray of light, right? There could be things blocking this light or whatever. So you are the master of your composition, and you choose the light source or the things that you want to highlight, whether it's with detail, shape, contrast, lighting, whatever. And that's something that you would need to develop as you go along in your development. But it's something that I would like to already give to you guys as a tip, because we are entertainers and designers. We're not people that are looking for technical accuracy. It's the same with our anatomy and whatever. We want to entertain people. We don't want to make the most realistic picture there is. Even if it's, photo bashing, if you look at things from One Pixel Brush, their lighting is meticulously chosen to shine on certain things or highlight certain things, or their shadows are meticulously chosen to, darken certain things, or their shadow groups are meticulously chosen. Everything is graphically chosen. Even if it looks super realistic, there's always a graphic element to it, right? And that's something that you need to keep in mind when designing. All right. I think that's it for the values. Oh yeah, one last thing that I had about values was value grouping. So value grouping plays into the real estate that I was also talking about. And the shadows that we were talking about in the beginning of this classroom is that with shadow mapping, you also group all your shadows into one shadow usually, right? Or have you minimize the amount of shadow groups that you have to maximize the efficiency of your painting. And it's the exact same with value grouping in your landscapes. You're trying to group your dark values and your light values to, again, make things graphically interesting. Because if I were to put some dark values over here and some more dark values, over here somewhere and maybe over here, things would get noisy too quickly. And it wouldn't have a sense of aesthetics that we are all looking for when we're designing environments. So value grouping is a really important thing. And one of the best designers at the moment, contemporary artists, concept artists, when it comes to value grouping is John J. Park. If you look at John Park's work, he's a master of value grouping. He's really good at it. It's one of his best attributes in his compositions. So if you don't know who he is, John J. Park, definitely check him out. Or Craig Mullins, those guys are real masters of value grouping, and it's really important that you also take this in the back of your mind when you're designing a picture. All right. And then lastly, we have about 10 minutes left. Lastly, I wanted to show you guys a student example of someone that is doing my mentorship. And so the assignment was for him to design a keyframe that was fitting to the Wild West challenge that we did in July. And so he chose a scene where there are people either just having captured a monster, or a monster is kind of, in the vicinity of a train, and some heroes, right? It's a pretty basic, very clear picture that he wanted. And so that's the first thumbnail that he sent me. And as you can see, the things that I've been repeating in this classroom are also the things that beginners tend to, the mistakes that they tend to make when they're designing a picture. So one of the first things that I noticed is that the division of shapes is too equal, right? If we have our balance, if we have our scale, right, like this, we have an equal amount of information on this side as this side, also equally divided. Excuse me. That's what makes it less interesting to look at, right? It makes things a bit stale. And again, when it comes to real estate, another factor is that there's too much real estate divided to one element. And not only that, his horizon line is bang center in the middle of this composition. And if you look back, if you reflect on what I've been talking about in terms of your rule of thirds and your golden ratio, is that it's better, or usually, in the beginning when you're learning, it's easier to use these rule of thirds to divide up your canvas and make things more interesting. Especially in landscapes, the placement of your horizon is pretty crucial. So I advise them to kind of lower the horizon line, make the perspective a bit more clear, and kind of divide his real estate. So the things that you've been seeing during this classroom is what I've sent him with some notes on how we can divide his picture, right? And then in the second step, he sent me this, right? Already a lot better, there's a Dutch angle a little bit going on. There's a better division of real estate. The difference with the first thumbnail is like night and day, right? Again, there's a little bit of a confusion when it comes to value grouping. A bit too equal in terms of the clouds going on, and the perspective was still a bit confusing, as well as there was no foreground, right? So that's something that a lot of, even in this one, a lot of beginners tend to forget, is put a good foreground, because that's a really good way to frame your picture. Putting in a foreground really helps to add depth to your picture. So I made a paint over for him. That looks like this. Okay, so why does this work a bit better, in my opinion? Is that one, we have that foreground, kind of breaking up the depth of our image. We have multiple layers of ground levels. We have this one, that one, that one. We have somewhat of a shape contrast, because we have the environment is pretty rectangular, right? And then we have our very rounded worm-like creature in the background. Okay, so we're using shape contrast to add interest to the scene and make our focal point a lot more clear. And then also, in terms of the leading lines that we were talking about in types of composition, I'm using my clouds and my ground plane to lead the viewer into that monster, which is our focal point, right? So then I think next, after he kind of understood this, it was time for him to move into color. And we haven't really discussed color in this classroom, but I just wanted to touch upon it briefly because it's a student example. So he wanted to move into color, and he wanted to make this a sunset painting. And so he kind of followed everything that I told him when it comes to the composition and breaking up the shapes and the division and whatever. But then when it came to the color, he forgot all his values. And this is one of the main reasons that I wanted to show you guys this, is that that's why it's so important to learn your values first, really get a good grasp for value, and then start moving into color and learning what color has what value. Because as soon as he needed to make this composition in color, he lost all of his value knowledge, right? If you look at the value composition that he did for this painting, it looks so much better than the color composition. And the reason is that you're not really that acquainted yet with value, and so you're breaking a lot of the rules that you don't actually need to break. And so what I did in the paint over was make those values apparent again, right? It's not like, wow, these are beautiful colors, this is amazing. It's just that I'm only considering the values, the contrast of the values, the contrast of shape, the division of my planes, and just, even when I'm lighting these clouds, I'm again thinking of those guiding lines going to my vanishing point, right, which is my focal point. So again, usually the difference between a beginner and a professional is that a professional can juggle all these concepts and fundamentals at the same time. And that's why it's so exhausting when you're starting to learn how to do all of this. And that's why sometimes you get demotivated. But again, I'm doing these classrooms to show you that there are so many layers of difficulty that you need to go through. And it's not that they're hard to go through, it's just that you need to go through them. And that's why you shouldn't get demotivated or discouraged. It's just something that you need to pick up, keep in the back of your mind, move on, and then relearn it. That's where mileage comes in. You need to repeat this until you get a good grasp of it, that you can do it naturally or intuitively, right? And then just quickly looking at the example that I did in one of those paint overs that I showed you. So we have this basic simple graphic thing that I made, right? And now we're going to assign some value to it. So what I first do is I kill the white of the canvas, get rid of that red. I make my foreground. It's this sort of L-shaped composition. Again, I'm constantly thinking about this graphic shape, right? That's all that's in the back of my mind, is this composition is what I thought worked graphically, so it needs to be translated into my more detailed painting as well. So I have my foreground. I add an extra layer of foreground, just to create some depth. I create some of the elements in the midground. I add my creature, looking all menacing. I add another layer of midground to again add some depth to the scene. And then maybe you could add some clouds or whatever, right? So, but even with these 7 simple steps, you can add a lot of depth into a painting already. And if the value works, as soon as the value works, then usually you can get away with everything, right? The camera angle is dependent on the horizon line. Yeah, well, the other way around. The horizon line is dependent on the camera angle. So depending on what camera angle you choose to use, your horizon line will change. All right, and that's actually all I had for this lesson, and that's impeccable timing, 1 hour. Do you guys have any questions or something? Yeah, Mac. So that's why I was saying that the values, right? Keep your three values in mind at first. Try to think of your dark foreground, your grayish halftone midground, and your lighter background. And it doesn't have to be a stark contrast like I have here. It just needs to go from dark to lighter, right? And just thinking, considering like three values or 4 to 5 values, is already good enough practice to start making your compositions, and then start thinking about, shape contrast and rhythm and stuff like that. Well, twofold, Daniel, is you study values by one, um, knowing the concept of lighting, right? Like I said in the beginning with the shadow mapping, assigning a proper value to your shadows, not breaking the value of your shadows and your lights, right? Not confusing that is already a big step in the right way. And then when it comes to landscape values or environment values, yes, looking at masters, doing master studies, even if they're in color, try to do them in value yourself, is a really good way to um, to study your gray tones or values. And also, taking stills from cinematography, it's one of the best ways to learn compositions, especially if you want to get into cinematic composition, because that's all that directors of photography do, right? They consider the graphic shapes that their actors are making on the canvas, the lighting that they're going to choose to set the mood, the lines that they're framing that they're going to use. That's something that you really can learn from looking at movies or cinematography or whatever, right? And then just studying your favorite artists, right? If there are artists that you really like, studying them is a really good way to start understanding values better. All right, so that's it from me, guys. I'm gonna stop recording. This session is officially closed.